on December 28th by 3 months through March of this year. Democrat Senator Jack Reed and Republican Dean Heller of Nevada have crafted the bill. A test vote is set for 10:30. And now to live coverage of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order, and the chaplain, retired Admiral Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Out of the depths, we lift our hearts to you, O God, waiting for your providence to prevail more than they that watch for sunrise. Guide our senators to find hope in your presence as they trust the unstoppable cycle of seed time and harvest. Lord, give our lawmakers such reverence for you that they will stand for right, although the heavens fall. May they delight in any work they do for you, and tire of any rest that is apart from you. Create in them clean hearts, which no unworthy purpose may tempt aside. May they wait for the power of your Spirit working through their faith to do more than they can ask or imagine. We pray in your great name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance and pledge.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Have a good day.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte.
Your time there be provided.
Mr. President.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Majority Leader.
Thank you very much. Following my remarks and those of the Republican leader, the Senate will resume consideration of the motion to proceed to...
We are in a quorum call, Mr. Leader.
And I did it. And I did it. I should have known. So, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to call the quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
So, Mr. President, following my remarks and those of the Republican leader, the Senate will resume motion to proceed to count number 265, unemployment insurance compensation. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the time that I use, leader time, and that of Senator McConnell, not count against the half hour that the proponents and opponents of this legislation have to speak, 15 minutes on each side.
Without objection.
So the vote will drag just a little bit, but it won't be much. My remarks are fairly short. So, Mr. President, the Senate will recess from 12:30 to 2:15 to allow for weekly caucus meetings. Mr. President, over the last 45 months, America's private sector has done okay Not great, but done pretty well. 8 million jobs have been created. Stock market's booming. And even the housing market is starting to show signs of life. A number of states were hit so hard with the decline in the housing market. Nevada was hit the hardest. California, Florida, Michigan, a number of states were hit really hard. But even in those states, the housing market is turning around a little bit. Not enough, but turning around. So, Mr. President, it's clear that the economy is picking up steam. Not enough steam, but picking up steam. But for too many Americans, far too many Americans, these bright headlines that I've just announced, touting good economic news, don't match the darker reality of their lives. They sit at the kitchen table, if they're lucky, and have a kitchen table to sit. They're juggling their bills. Mr. President, on the way to work this morning, this was brought to my attention so very, very clearly about how hard it is for some people. On Constitution Avenue, as we were waiting for a light, I could see off to the left news camera and a reporter trying to wake up somebody that had been spending the night there on the pavement, not on one of the grates where the heat comes up. They were kept pushing and pushing. You could see they were talking to him. He didn't come out of there, or she didn't come out of that bundle of material on that sidewalk. Now, Mr. President, I don't know if this man is one of the long-term unemployed. I don't know. But there are lots of people who are in desperate shape. They may not be sleeping on a sidewalk on Constitution Avenue, 14 blocks from the White House. But there are people who are desperate in America for help. $1.3 million people have already lost their unemployment insurance benefits. This is not good for the country because we're told by economists that for every dollar we spend on unemployment benefits, it gets $1.50 back to us, just like that. And so we have to start understanding that we have a country that not everyone's benefiting from what's going on with these headlines I just reported. Mr. President, during the last 30 years, the top 1%'s income and wealth has increased 300%. Middle class dropped 10%, about almost 10%. Think about that. 300%, middle class about 10% drop. I haven't even mentioned the poor. They have been hit harder than anyone else. When I say this, it's true. The rich are getting a lot richer and the poor are getting poorer. Middle class being squeezed. Mr. President, I have nothing against people of wealth. It's great we live in a country where people can make a lot of money. But we have to understand there are people really hurting. And for those who have lost their jobs through no fault of their own, millions of whom have struggled for months to find new work, a buoying stock market and increasing corporate profits are little comfort to them. Fortunately, Americans looking for work have been able to rely on unemployment insurance to get them through the tough times. For 1.3 million people, no deal. 20,000 of them are veterans returning from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. At the end of last year, just a few days ago, Congress failed to extend emergency unemployment insurance for Americans who've been looking for work for more than 6 months. We have never in the history of our country had long-term unemployment like we have today. Never in the history of our republic. And yet we're turning 1.3 million people away. Are they going to be the next ones sleeping on some street and wherever they come from, trying to stay warm? For many Americans, these benefits make the difference between being able to live a decent life, not a good life, a decent life, and going hungry or becoming homeless. Last year, no, let's go back to 2012. In 2012, unemployment insurance helped 2.5 million people, including 600,000 children, from going into the roles of poverty. We don't have all the results from last year. These families live in red states, blue states, or Republicans, Democrats, or independents. We shouldn't turn our backs on them, Mr. President. In the past, we've worked together on this. Did we complain when President Bush came to us? Unemployment was nowhere near where it is now. There were not long-term unemployed. And we just automatically together extended those benefits. Not today. We're not doing it because we can't get the Republicans to help us. We've reached out a hand to hardworking Americans struggling to get by. I would hope, Mr. President, we can get a few Republicans to join Dean Heller of Nevada, a conservative senator. Join with Dean Heller, the junior senator from Nevada, and help get this legislation passed. The latest round of emergency assistance, you know who signed that bill? It was President Bush. At the time, the unemployment rate was about 5.5%. In Nevada today, and in Rhode Island, where Senator Jack Reed's going to come and talk about this, I'm sure, it's 9%. So today's long-term unemployment rate is more than double what it was at the time that we let emergency jobless assistance expire. Senator Heller understands this. I am troubled that most of Senator Heller's Republican colleagues, according to what we're hearing in the press, callously turn their backs on the long-term unemployed. So, Mr. President, I'm just saying I hope that we can get them to move over and help us, help these people who just need it so very, very much. Failing to restore emergency assistance would not only be a crushing blow to long-term unemployed, it would be a blow to our economy. Americans use their unemployment benefits to buy food and fuel at gas stations, to pay the landlord, or to purchase a child a coat. That's why every dollar we spend on unemployment benefits, I repeat, the economy grows by $1.50. This investment in our fellow Americans is one of the most effective ways to spark and sustain an economic recovery. Last night, the senior senator from Texas, a Republican, asked that we delay this vote on legislation today. I was glad to do that. He called this a serious issue, and he is so right. The senior senator from Texas is so right. This is a serious issue. It's as serious to people from outside Nevada as it is to those people in Nevada who have been out of work for so long. But those people in Nevada who have written and called my office begging for a little more time. For every job that's available, there are 3 that are unemployed in America. We Democrats stand united in support of this extension. Republicans need to take this seriously as well as we do. So I hope Republicans remember that during hard times, during times of high unemployment, regardless of who is in the White House or who led this chamber, Congress has always been willing to put politics aside and put American families first. I would ask the chair to announce the business of the day.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is...
President, I would note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
The Republican leader.
I ask consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'd indicated to the Majority Leader I was going to ask consent, which I'm prepared to do at this point. I have to admit I'm a little surprised at the fervor with which the Majority is dedicated to reviving the expired emergency unemployment benefits after they ignored the issue all of last year. I'm sure there are many on my side who would like to see these additional weeks of benefits extended if, like the Speaker of the House indicated he supported, we could find a way to extend them without actually adding to the national debt. So to that end, I'd like to propose that we be allowed, my side be allowed to offer an amendment to pay for these benefits by lifting the burden of Obamacare's individual mandate for 1 year and take care of our veterans who were harmed by the recently agreed-to budget deal while we are at it in the same amendment. And once that is disposed of, we can have an actual debate on this issue and an amendment process here in the Senate, which hasn't happened very often in recent times. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that if cloture is invoked on the motion to proceed to S. 1845, that all post-cloture time be yielded back and the Senate proceed to consideration of the bill, and that my amendment with Senator Hatch be the first amendment in order, and that there be up to 1 hour of debate on the amendment divided in the usual form. Following use or yielding back of that time, the Senate then proceed to a vote in relation to that amendment. I further ask consent that following the disposition of that amendment, it be in order for the Majority Leader or his designee to offer an amendment, and it be in order for the leaders or their designees to continue to offer amendments in alternating fashion, which used to be the way we did business around here.
Is there an objection?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object. And I appreciate how candid my Republican counterpart is, and I say that seriously. Mr. President, I do speak with I try. I'm not real good at speaking with a lot of fervor, as everyone knows, but I feel very strongly about this issue. People are unemployed, can't find a job. It's a tough deal. As I fortunately have always had a job. I can't say the same for my family, especially my dad. So I do speak with as much fervor as I'm capable on this issue. But the reason I mention I'm glad that my friend speaks with being so candid is listen to this picture, Mr. President. No one can anyway dispute my facts. For every dollar spent on this, we get $1.50 back. That doesn't add to the deficit. So as I get this picture from the consent that I saw, we're going to take away Obamacare, which 9 million new people have it, and they're signing up at the rate of thousands every day, new people. We're going to take their benefits away from them in some form or fashion. And we're going to trump the bipartisan agreement that we have with with Mikulski and Rogers. They're coming up with an omnibus bill, and I know my friend has already stated that he initially was against the budget deal. But, Mr. President, and I would bet that that's addressed in this deal that Mikulski and Rogers come up with, this helping veterans. So, Mr. President, this is a guise to obstruct, as has been happening during the 5 years that President Obama has been President of the United States, and I object with as much fervor as I can.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, over the past several days, we've seen a number of stories about how Democrats plan to spend the year gearing up for November elections by making an issue out of economic hardships faced by Americans. In other words, instead of working on reforms that would actually help people overcome the challenges so many of them face in this economy, Democrats plan to exploit those folks for political gain. It's really pretty amazing when you think about it. We're now in the sixth year of the Obama administration. We all know the stock market's been doing great, so the richest among us are doing just fine. But what about the poor? What about working class folks? What about folks who work in industries that liberals don't approve of, like coal? How many of these Americans have been doing well during the Obama economy? Well, record numbers of them are having a perfectly terrible time. One indicator is the growth of the food stamp program. Consider this. Since the President took office, the number of Americans who've signed up for food stamps has literally skyrocketed. It's up almost half. And nearly 4 out of 10 unemployed Americans are trapped, literally trapped in long-term unemployment. What's worse, the poorest Americans are the ones who've often had the hardest time recovering in this economy. Yes, the President took office in the midst of an economic crisis. No one disputes that. But for many Americans, a terrible situation seems to have only gotten worse over the course of this administration. So for the President to turn around and try to blame his political opponents for the suffering we've seen out there, well, that takes a pretty good amount of nerve. It also assumes a collective case of national amnesia. It would take a collective case of national amnesia to reach those conclusions. Because remember, these are the same folks who gave us the stimulus, who gave us tax increases, who gave us Obamacare. All of it was done in the name of helping the little guy, in the name of greater equality. So what's it given us? It's given us this mess that we have in our country. Record numbers of long-term unemployed, record numbers on food stamps, people losing their health care plans, others seeing the premiums shoot up when they can least afford it, and now another call, one more call for a government fix. Washington Democrats have shown almost no interest for 5 years in working together on ways to create the kind of good, stable, high-paying jobs that people really want and need. This is a real disservice. First and foremost, to those who are struggling the most out there, from the college graduate who suddenly finds herself wondering why she's got huge student loan debts but no prospects of work, to the 50-year-old dad who's worked his whole adult life but suddenly can't find a job that meets either his needs or his potential. And yet this administration's proposed solution is just to slap another Band-Aid from Washington on it and call it a day. Yes, we should work on solutions to support those who are out of work through no fault of their own. But there's literally no excuse to pass unemployment insurance legislation without also finding ways to create good, stable, high-paying jobs and also trying to find the money to pay for it. So what I'm saying is, let's support meaningful job creation measures. And let's find a way to pay for these UI benefits so we're not adding to an already completely unsustainable debt. Unfortunately, the administration seems almost totally disinterested in solutions that don't put government in the lead. And it seems nearly incapable of working with those who don't share that belief. And that, in many ways, is precisely why we're in the situation we're in. Because it's only when you believe government is the answer to all of your problems that you talk about unemployment insurance instead of job creation, and the minimum wage instead of helping people reach their maximum potential. So it's time to get away from, quote, temporary government programs and give the American people the tools they need to drive an economy that truly works for them and for their families. We could start with one of the real bright spots in our economy, and that's energy, a field that's poised to help our economy create literally millions of jobs, if only the administration would get out of the way. Another area where we should be able to work together is health care. By almost any metric, affordability, accessibility, even the ratio of cancellations to enrollments, this law has imposed more pain and more distress than many had ever thought possible. Centrists, moderates, conservatives, just about any sensible person outside the congressional Democratic leadership here in Washington has long understood this. But now even the left is starting to come to grips with the painfully obvious fact that the law that it fell in love with can't possibly work. Last week, one of the great poobahs of the left admitted that Obamacare is awful, direct quote, calling it, quote, the dirty little secret many liberals have avoided saying out loud. I don't agree with this man on much else, including his broader ideas on health care, but it's good to hear a grandee of the left at least admit that this isn't working. And his words point to a larger truth, that the President's Amen chorus had ample opportunity to speak truth to power when it mattered, and that most chose to remain silent. For that, the law's apologists have left the American people to pay the price. Let me read you part of a letter I recently received from Jennifer Bell, a constituent of mine in Hopkinsville. This is what she said. I have less coverage than I did before. I didn't get to keep my policy that I was happy with. Every dollar I have to pay more is a dollar taken from my family. I never thought that in America we would be forced to purchase something we cannot afford. We worked hard to get where we are. Now we're being forced to pay more in order to pay for somebody else's insurance. How is that fair? I hear you, Jennifer. Everyone on this side of the aisle hears those concerns. And here's something else. Many Kentuckians are finding that Obamacare is about more than just higher premiums and cuts to Medicare. It's also about a lack of access to doctors and hospitals. One of the most left-wing papers in my state recently ran a big story about how many Obamacare coverage networks exclude so many of the hospitals my constituents want to use. A few weeks ago, the Majority Leader basically said that criticisms of Obamacare amounted to jokes. Well, you might like to think this is all some joke, but the constituents who've been writing me about the consequences of this failed law don't see it that way. I know this must weigh heavily on our Democratic colleagues. I know they can't see so many Americans hurting because of decisions they made and feel absolutely nothing. Well, let me say this to our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. It's a new year and a time for new beginnings. So if you're ready to work with us, we're here. Together we can start over on health care. Together we can give the American people the kind of health reform they really deserve, reform that can lower costs and improve the quality of care. But just like with solving the problems of joblessness and unemployment, it's something we can only do together. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the motion to proceed to S. 1845, which the clerk will report. Under the previous order,
Motion to proceed to calendar number 265 as 1845, a bill to provide for the extension of certain unemployment benefits and for other purposes.
Under the previous order, there will be 30 minutes of debate, equally divided and controlled in the usual form.
Mr. President.
The Assistant Majority Leader.
Mr. President, on the side supporting the pending motion, there's 15 minutes under the unanimous consent agreement. Similar amount of time on the other side. If all time is used, notify members. Our roll call vote will be at about 11 o'clock. And I ask consent that on our side supporting the motion that I be allotted 5 minutes, Senator Reid of Rhode Island 5 minutes, and Senator Klobuchar of Minnesota 5 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I listened carefully to the Republican leader here. Here's what he said. Here's what he said. If we are going to give 1.3 million Americans unemployment insurance that is now expired, if we're going to give it to them, we have to pay for it. And then he suggested how he would pay for it. He would pay for it by attacking Obamacare. That's no surprise. But the provision that he would attack is the individual mandate, the mandate that people buy health insurance. Well, what's the impact of that? The mandate that people have a responsibility to buy health insurance is necessary if we are going to protect Americans from being discriminated against who have pre-existing conditions in their families. Follow me now. In order to make sure that a parent with a child who has asthma or a child who has diabetes can still buy health insurance, we needed to expand the insurance pool. We expanded the insurance pool by saying to everyone across America, you have a responsibility to buy health insurance. So what Senator McConnell, on behalf of Senate Republicans, is suggesting is this. If we're going to give 1.3 million Americans unemployment insurance, we have to say to everyone living in America, we can no longer keep our promise that health insurance will not discriminate against your family because of a pre-existing condition. Wow, what a trade-off. 1.3 million people get unemployment benefits. Over 300 million Americans lose the protection of discrimination in their health insurance because of a pre-existing condition in their families. That is the Republican logic. That's the Republican logic. Help the unemployed, but at the expense of 300 million American families and their health insurance protection. It's interesting to note that we have had a dramatic increase in people living in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, represented by Senator McConnell, when it comes to the Affordable Care Act. Governor Beshear, a Democrat, is promoting affordable care in Kentucky and has one of the most successful efforts underway across America, yet every day he's given a chance, the senators from Kentucky, both, I might add, come to the floor and criticize the very program that's so popular in their state. The second point I want to make is this. All we are asking for this morning is a vote to start the debate on unemployment insurance benefits. We are asking 5 Republicans to join 55 Democrats to let us debate whether we extend unemployment benefits across America. It is just that simple. And about 11 o'clock, that vote will take place. Mr. President, this used to be a bipartisan issue. You're the newest member of the Senate here, and I welcome you again from the state of New Jersey. There was a time when Republican presidents thought unemployment compensation was a pretty good idea. Why? Because families where the breadwinners are out of work need to feed their children, need to feed themselves. Senator McConnell criticizes this program as a temporary government handout. Let me tell you, if you don't have food on the table, you need a temporary helping hand. So you can put food on the table so you're strong enough tomorrow to go out and look for jobs again. That's what it's all about. And they don't get it. They say we should be talking about creating jobs. What about creating some food in the bellies of children? What about paying the utility bill or the rent or keeping the lights on or keeping the place that you live warm enough while you're out looking for a job? That is part of the reality facing people across America. 81,867 individuals in my home state of Illinois lost their benefits between Christmas and New Year's, unemployed people. They've written me letters. A 35-year-old man from Antioch, Illinois, Ryan, writes to me with 2 children about how difficult it is for him to keep his family together while he continues day after weary day looking for a job. What I hear from the Republican leader is, well, isn't it a shame that Ryan doesn't have a job, but we can't let government come in and provide the solution? Well, I'll tell you, historically, government has stepped up when the private sector cannot or will not. And in this case, we know it's absolutely essential. What we need to ask is 5 Republicans to at least give us a chance this morning at 11 o'clock to move forward on the debate on unemployment insurance. This is basic and it's humane. It used to be bipartisan before the Tea Party takeover of the Republican Party. I hope there are enough moderates left on the Republican side to join us to make this a bipartisan issue again. Helping people keep their families together, the lights on, the heat in their homes, and food on the table while they're looking for a job is not a government giveaway. For goodness sakes, it defines who we are as a nation. If we can't stand up and help these people looking for work, then sadly, it's a sad commentary on who we are, where we are, and our principles. And finally, this notion of thrashing out at Obamacare, every time there's an issue coming up on the floor, has reached its extreme today when the Republican leader would eliminate the protection against discrimination for pre-existing conditions for 300 million Americans in order to provide unemployment benefits for 1.3 million.
The Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, could you instruct me when I reach the 4-minute mark?
Yes.
So I may reserve a minute for the very end. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise to urge all my colleagues to support this motion to bring this legislation to the floor to begin a debate. 1.3 million Americans have been pushed off an economic cliff on December 28th when their unemployment benefits, their extended benefits, ended. They're searching for work. They have to search for work. They're in a market where there's typically 2 or 3 applicants for one job. Yesterday, I read a story from the Washington Post that talked about the opening of a new dairy plant in Maryland. They were expecting a lot of interest into 36 jobs, 1,600 applicants. I would wager many of those applicants never thought in their lives, after being a vice president of sales at a company or a sophisticated manager of a financial aspects of a company, would be applying to work in a dairy. Some of them, I expect, might even be on extended benefits, and that's the only thing keeping them whole, and they're looking for work. 1,600 applicants, 36 jobs. That's not unique to Maryland. That's in my home state of Rhode Island. That's in states all across this country, Nevada, Tennessee, Arizona, states that have unemployment numbers that are above the national average, above 7%. In my case, it's 9%. We have to help these families. And as Senator Durbin pointed out, we've done this on a bipartisan basis until very recently. This is a smart economic program. This program will, according to CBO, create 200,000 jobs next year if we extend it. Those are 200 jobs we're going to give away. And the minority leader was talking about how we've got to do more to create jobs around here. Well, if we don't pass this measure, CBO has told us we're going to forfeit 200,000 jobs. So from an economic basis in this country, this is smart. But from a human basis, from helping people who've worked their lives, the only way you qualify for this program is you work. And then you're let go through no fault of your own. So we have to do that. And the other side is talking about, and others, colleagues are talking about, well, we've got to pay for these benefits. Well, this is a selective sort of notion. Because frankly, the last time we extended these benefits in January of 2013, it was not offset. And the vote was 89-8. Now, it included tax provisions and other provisions, but we extended these benefits unpaid for 89-8. And yet now, we have to pay for these benefits. Well, what we've done, Senator Hill and I said, listen, we need to help these people now. Let's do a 90-day extension. Provide some retroactive relief and keep these 1.3 million, and it'll grow, because there'll be more than several million more people who will lose their benefits this year. Let's do it, and then let's sit down and work on this program. But let me also remind my colleagues, we have made significant changes to the unemployment insurance program. In early 2012, we had a conference report between the House and the Senate that made changes in unemployment insurance. We reduced the total time from 99 weeks to 73 weeks. We created the work-sharing program, a very innovative program that allows people to collect for part of the week but also stay employed the rest of the week. It's a program that's helped companies all across the country, small companies particularly. We've given states more flexibility on job training. We've given states more flexibility in oversight of their programs. We've made changes. We're willing to listen to thoughtful proposals again, but we can't do it on the backs of 1.3 million Americans who are lost the only benefit they've got. And if you really want to talk about job training, if you really want to talk about cooperation, why haven't we been able to reauthorize the Workforce Investment Act since 1998? We have not reauthorized since 1998. We have not made the changes in workforce training that affects this whole country, not just the unemployed, but those young people who are trying to move out of high school and junior college into the workforce. We haven't done it. Why? Well, 1998, Republican Congress until 2007. And since 2007, we've been struggling very mightily with an economic crisis, and we've made progress. But if you want to start cooperating, let's bring that Workforce Investment Act to the floor. It's passed the committee, I'm told, on a bipartisan basis, the Help Committee. Let's bring it to the floor. Let's help people. And I will reserve the balance of my time.
Would the Senator from Rhode Island yield for a question? Does the Senator have any remaining time?
There are 3.5 minutes remaining.
There are 3.5 minutes remaining on the proponent's side.
I'd ask the Senator from Rhode Island under that time to yield to the following question. The Senator, I don't know if you were on the floor, when the Republican leader came and said he wanted to pay for the cost of these unemployment benefits by eliminating the individual mandate under the Affordable Care, which is the key element in protecting families who have children with pre-existing conditions, cancer survivors, children with diabetes, children with asthma. As I understood the Republican leader, he believes that the best way to take care of people who are unemployed and can't feed their children is to deny the protections of Affordable Care Act for those families who have children with pre-existing conditions. Would the Senator from Rhode Island comment on whether that is a good trade for either side?
I think it's a terrible trade because it's not just about families with children. It's about many of these working adults who, if they get a pre-existing condition, they lose their coverage. It's not just a question of children. That, I think, is very, very sensitive, and you put a point on it. But without the Affordable Care Act, if you get sick, you can't get coverage. The only people who can get coverage if you're middle-aged is if you're really healthy, and you don't need it. Once you need it, the insurance companies take it away before Affordable Care.
I might ask another question of the Senator from Rhode Island on the time that is allotted on our side. I listened carefully to the speech given by the Republican leader, the Senate leader, this morning. And I see my colleague from New York is taking the floor, and we have a limited amount of time, so I'm going to yield the floor at this point.
I thank my friend from Illinois.
The Senator from New York.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank my friend from Illinois and my friend from Rhode Island. How much time is left on our side?
1 minute and 30 seconds.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. President. And I see what's going on here. Our colleagues on the other side of the aisle know the power of this issue, but don't really want to vote for it. And so they're putting impossible logjams in the path. Who would believe that on this side of the aisle we would delay an important part of the ACA that would hurt, as my colleague from Illinois and my colleague from Rhode Island brought out, parents who have kids with cancer. Not going to do that, and not going to do it on the fly. And so what I'd say to my colleagues is if you believe in unemployment benefits and extending them, pass them clean and simple. Don't play games. Don't put obstacles in their path that you know would be insurmountable. Get it done. And I'd make one other point, and that is this. If I see my colleague from Minnesota here, if she wants to take the remaining seconds. Okay. I'd make this point, Mr. President. Bottom line is very simple. Very simple. People want to work. People who have lost their jobs after working decades for a company are knocking on doors every day. They are going online. They're desperate to work, and this idea
the Senator's time has expired.
That they don't want to work, that unemployment and benefits encourage them not to work is balderdash. I yield the floor.
The Senator from Georgia.
I yield back all time on the Republican side.
All time is yielded back. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 265, S-1845, a bill to provide for the extension of certain unemployment benefits and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate the debate on the motion to proceed to S-1845, a bill to provide for the extension of certain unemployment benefits and for other purposes shall be brought to a close. The yeas and the nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Bekich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin,
Our basketball dog, George Washington,
Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn,
were you home the whole time? Saw the
Mr. Cochran,
Oh, that's wonderful.
Ms. Collins,
Glad to hear it.
Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johanns, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Booker, Cardin, Coons, Heller, Menendez, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, and Rockefeller. Senators voting in the negative: Coburn, Cornyn, Crapo, Inhofe, Isaacson, and Vitter. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Kirk, no. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Johans, no. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Johnson, Wisconsin, no. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Flake? No. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mrs. Murray? Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Casey? Aye. Mr. Blunt? No. Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mr. Sanders? Mr. Sanders? Aye. Mr. Brown? Aye. Ms. Collins? Ms. Collins? Aye. Mr. Grassley? Mr. Grassley? No. Mr. Kane? Aye. Mr. Tester? Aye. Mr. Levin? Aye. Mr. Manchin? Aye. Mr. Nelson? Mr. Nelson? Aye. Mr. Roberts? No. Mr. Pryor? Aye. Mr. Warner? Aye. Mr. King? Aye. Mr. Cochran? No. Mr. Scott? No. Mr. Donnelly? Aye. Mr. Bennett? Aye. Ms. Coates? Mr. Coates? Aye. Mr. Hoven? Mr. Hoven? No. Mr. McCain? No. Mr. Franken? Aye. Mr. Burr? No. Mr. Lee? No. Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Ms. Hirono? Ms. Hirono? Aye. Ms. Warren? Aye. Ms. Ayotte? Aye. Mr. Barrasso? No. Mr. Enzi? Mr. Enzi? No. Yeah, there's aye. Ms. Klobuchar? Aye. Mr. Paul? No. Mr. Baucus? Aye. Ms. Cantwell? Aye. Mr. Merkley? Mr. Merkley? Aye. Mr. Sessions? No. Mr. Graham? No. Mr. Risch? No. Mr. Shelby? Mr. Shelby? No. Mrs. Fisher? No. Mr. Bozeman? No. Mr. Heinrich? Aye. Mr. Murphy? Aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota? Aye. Mr. Corker? No. Mr. Markey? Aye. Mr. Chambliss? No. Mr. Wyden? Mr. Wyden? Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand? Aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado? Aye.